Hey, everybody. Welcome. Some of you know me. I'm Nicola Rossini from the Harriet Bee's Daughters channel and another colleague in the field. But today we're gathering for a special spotlight as part of our mental health awareness programming this month. It is AAPHI History Month. It is also Mental Health Awareness Month, and TETV has started to look around at what are some things that we could offer, which meant that I got to make one of my favorite phone calls. Bryan Huneycutt is joining us today. Bryan is a colleague in the industry. He's worked in many of the parks and offices, primarily in live show development, but also sometimes attractions where need be, as everything from an acrobat to a safety officer to a technical director and group manager. And lately, he's all but dissertation, which, as far as I'm concerned, is Dr. Huneycutt, working in the realm of psychological health and safety, specifically as it pertains to entertainment and where we can add that into location-based experiences and themed entertainment training. So I thought, what a great opportunity for us. Bryan's going to talk in on a couple of things. Number one is as you've seen in some of our run-up to this, behind the scenes initiative, which has been a force this year on getting more tools and training out to those of us in this time of pandemic. We're going to talk about this program in a minute, but what's great about it is it's not requiring a membership to anything or current employment in anywhere. If you work in the world of entertainment, particularly backstage, this applies to you. But when we were kind of brainstorming about what were things we wanted to make sure we talked about this week, one of the things that I always find as a manager, as somebody who is deeply involved in these tactics and topics, and as a student of post-traumatic growth myself, is it always feels like a behemoth. It feels like a large, immovable structural difficulty, and nobody ever knows how to start. And one of the great things that has been my pleasure working with Bryan has been to help people break down quick, easy things to start with, and recognition of tools that are already there. One of the biggest barriers to change is when we think we're doing it alone, struggling in the darkness. So we're going to take some time today. Kelsey Connolly, our phenomenal producer, and Reagan Willman, who is joining us to train on, will also be monitoring. Put everything up into the comments. We're starting to see folks come in and say hi. We love a big open conversation, and Bryan and I have the ability to be here as long as it goes. Some of these have gotten super heated at other conferences we've done. And I want to take a moment that, laughter is a trauma response. So sometimes we're going to say something and we're going to laugh, and it seems like that's an awful place to do it. It's like, that's actually your nervous system tapping out. When people's voices rage, when our nostrils flare, when we get there, that is also these topics working themselves out of our nervous system. The nervous system is this funny thing, because it's actually a binary, right? It's on or it's off. And it doesn't know if the threat is actually a lion standing in front of you or the memory of a lion standing in front of you. All of these things are real. So I want everybody at home to kind of accept that for this hour. As things come up, if you feel it, let it have some space, because when it has space, it can move out. You know that my co-host lives here with me for most shows. That's so that I can punch a clown when I need to, because this is a safe clown to punch. Giving ourselves those tactics, those are some great places, and we're gonna use that to bounce off. But I'm gonna give Bryan some space now. Bryan, talk to me about how you came to this work in mental health. Talk to me about what you're doing. Or talk to me about being a stilt walker for decades, because I always find that fascinating.
Oh, well, definitely all of those things are part of the journey. As you mentioned, I've been very lucky to work in most of the theme parks in Central Florida in some way, shape, or form, as a performer, as a stage manager, and getting just a huge amount of experience in the international parks as well. So, all of those things, we've learned something and have lessons from each one of those. Probably the thing that brings me the most on this journey is in dealing with performers and dealing with situations where performers might be struggling with how they're feeling. and what their emotions are and what their frustrations are, and really never having the right words and never having the right outlet for that, and understanding that we were asking people to, from the standpoint of dancing in a parade with your parade partner, I need you to be the loving couple from sightline to sightline. And after that, you may not even be friends. You may not even like the person that you're with. But for 27 minutes and 1.6 miles, I need you to be in love. And so we're asking people to do and portray many things. And how do we deal with that? How do we cope with that? What are our emotions in those things? What are our frustrations with some of the hours we work? Some of the times that it pulls us away from our families. Anyone who's worked in this world of live entertainment, we've missed concerts, we've missed Christmases, we've missed all of these things for the art that we do. And what is the effect of that? And really started my journey because there aren't a lot of people looking into these things in the world. In my most recent role with the Disney parks, I manage the entertainment safety teams. And as we're looking for research, as we're looking for theories and methodology related to many of these things, it simply doesn't exist. And so that one of the reasons I started my doctoral journey was to really try to create some of those things and try to create some of that research and take some of that research from the world and bring it back. And in that journey, one of my team members in our California team went to a mental health first aid class and brought it back to us. And it just was a wonderful opportunity. It spoke to many of the tools that we felt that we needed. And then my Florida team went and did that. And I immediately fell in love with the program, became a certified facilitator, and we launched so many things from that. And very lucky that the Behind the Scenes Foundation, with the work that they're doing, found an amazing opportunity to take that and to look deep into what is needed in our community and expand that. And the timing could not possibly be better. We were able to launch this program completely unintentionally during a pandemic. That was never by design, but one of the things that did happen is we're able to launch the mental health first aid program at a time when it's needed more than ever.
So, Bryan, I'm wondering can you give us like a 30,000 foot level, what is the mental health first aid program? And if you don't mind speaking from your position of experience, like what did you see change amongst folks as more trainings were offered and more of your colleagues had this training?
Well, really what the mental health first aid program is, if we break it down and we look at just the first aid part, first aid is that immediate response. If someone falls, they're hurt, they get a scrape, whatever, it's that immediate, what's going on? What can we do to react? Are we in a crisis mode? Does that person need comfort? Do they need medical care? So all of those triage things that happen in a moment of first aid. And you don't have to be a medical expert to render first aid. You can give that moment of care regardless, especially if you've had some training. If you have CPR, fantastic. Those first steps to get that person safe for now, which is one of the phrases that you may hear if you do the class. And so when we add mental health to that, we're talking about those same things, except instead of from the physical sense, we're moving into the mental space. We're moving into mental wellness. And what mental health first aid and the program really depends upon and focuses on is recognizing those signs and symptoms that help us identify when someone is having a challenge, when someone is struggling in a mental wellness capacity, and how do we help that person? How do we identify that they're having a challenge, and how can we assist with that challenge? And so the goals of the program are really that early intervention phase, because research shows that when we have an early intervention with someone, they are less likely to get to a crisis mode. They are less likely to have those traumas turn into a more significant risk factor. They are less likely to self-medicate with unsafe means, be those substance abuse or others. And we're able to help those individuals early on. And the goal of the program is really spreading within the community those signs and symptoms and those awareness and those tools about recognizing these things and then moving forward into action and being there to help one another.
Great. So how did this play out amongst your team as they got this training? What does that look like?
Well, one of the things, and just speaking from my experience of leading a team where we had some folks with this training, we really started to look at things differently. We started to look at not just the physical wellness of the cast, not just the physical wellness of the individual, but also what other things were going around. And also during this time, I was the excuse me, I was the commissioner for the United States Institute of Technical Theater for the Safety and Health Commission. And within that commission, we started to talk about wellness from an authentic self standpoint. So just from the entire community, we were moving from safety meant OSHA codes and standards to safety means physical injuries to safety is an all-encompassing thing. And so really looking at safety as a person-first conversation. And I have to give credit to a colleague, Anna Glover, who came up with the phrase, which I have absolutely adopted and used for one of my slogans, is people first, safety always. And so if we start from the core of the person and look at what the person needs, then the OSHA codes and standards kind of take care of themselves. I'm sure they're great to know. They're awesome to have. They're awesome to lean on when we have those questions. But if we start from what's right for the individual, then we're taking care of the whole person. And, all of that, to your point, all of that, starts, in here and in here. If we take care of the mind, if we take care of the heart, then we're taking care of the body in that aspect as well. So the team really moved from a standpoint of looking at twisted ankles and sore muscles and started looking about, how do you feel? Are you exhausted because you're physically exhausted, or are you exhausted because you were mentally and emotionally burnt out? And completely change the look at how we care for you, because ibuprofen is not always the answer for everything. So how do we move forward with treating the whole person?
Great. Talk to me a little bit about access to mental health first aid training. So one of the great things they did this summer, while they were getting better at online, was they offered free training for a lot of people. And I know that a big part of where behind the scenes has come in stepping up availability to this training.
Absolutely. So the great thing that behind the scenes has opened the doors for, and this is in partnership with IATSE. So IATSE members have access to the training trust, and the funding of the training trust can reimburse IATSE members for mental health first aid training. And so what we've done through Behind the Scenes Foundation and the Behind the Scenes site is we've really created a pipeline for folks to find the mental health first aid training, get scheduled for the classes. We have a lot of availability of the courses, and we're getting ready to drop even more courses. So it really has opened the doors to the community, and specifically opening the doors for the community from a standpoint of the live event space, and live events being theater, being film, being television, corporate events, and really looking at bringing in individuals from that standpoint and talking about the training from that standpoint, instead of talking about the training from the standpoint of a social worker or a counselor or an educator or law enforcement, which many of the programs are created for. And so we take the scenarios and we talk about the scenarios in a perspective of our world and what challenges are specifically ours. So we're able to just share so much more and have a conversation using the language that we all have and representing the different parts of the industry that we all represent, and really start building that community from the ground up.
Perfect. Thank you. So one of the things that I think is really important to talk about right now is that we don't actually have to wait for this to show up and be offered. Bryan is a resource. We've got his contact info in most of our blurbs for this, but you can also find him throughout like, I know that we have varying managers and organizational leaders watching this, right? We've got some great partners with TETV. Mental health first aid is the sort of thing that you can run like a CPR training where they can bring in a trainer for a team, or groups who have 2 or 3 employees can all meld together. Bryan, what's kind of the goal size for a group doing this training?
For right now, we one of the benefits of what has happened, the National Council for Mental Wellbeing has created a virtual format, which is what we're taking advantage of at behind the scenes. So in that virtual format, we have about 20 individuals as the perfect size group, because it is on Zoom. It does take quite a period of time. It's about a 5-hour class on Zoom, and it can be very intense. So we keep those at about 20 individuals. We are looking at scheduling and are in contact with several different organizations to do some in-person courses. I'm also trained as a COVID compliance officer, so I have the ability to think a little bit more broad about how we can safely do some of these courses in person. And so we're bringing those courses to several individuals. And in those spaces, we can go up to about 30 folks, and it can be done in a variety of ways. The course can be done as a fully in-person course, which takes about 8 hours, and it is a significant commitment, but is also a very deep training. A blended course can be done partially online and partially in person, so splitting up that time between those two. And then there's the full virtual option, which has some pre-course work that's done online, and then we come in and we spend the time together to talk about the principles that you learn online and start engaging with the steps that you learn as part of that training, and really putting that into practice on, once you've recognized those signs and symptoms, what do you do?
Great. And I think that's a really great kind of reminder that all of this is from the idea that a rising tide lifts all boats, right? The more that we're all comfortable with these conversations, start having familiarity with these topics, the more people in a given space that are ready to have these conversations. And that, frankly, what we're talking about is interhuman connection, which is really at the heart of a good immersive experience, right? Is that you feel like you're part of it, you feel like you're seen and you're felt. So in many ways, what we're talking about is giving the same care and connection to our colleagues as we do to our guests. Let's I don't see any comments here, so I'm going to just start diving in. Let's talk about some of the barriers to that in our industry, and with what's specific to entertainment. I think it's very easy for us to kind of turn an eye from that and say, like, oh, but we work in entertainment, we already know how to talk to people. Or similarly, these trainings could never understand my work environment because we have to be able to say whatever, whenever, because that's what creativity is. Let's talk about how mental health starts playing in with creative design spaces.
Well, that point is exactly why this really exists. In the creative space, in the creative world, for so long, we've said we're different. And for so long, we've said these things don't apply to us. Those things will never work for us. And that's really where we come in. And from the standpoint of behind the scenes, why it was so important to have an insider from the industry be the one facilitating this program and talking about this program, because an insider understands those challenges. An insider understands, I have a show opening date. I have these restrictions. I have different contracts. I have different unions I'm dealing with. I have all of these things. And I have the mindset of the show must go on. So in many cases, and for some folks, you may have heard this, but we've been saying at USITT for quite some time, we want to change that mindset of, instead of the show must go on, it becomes the show can go on, because we've taken the right steps. And just recently, I've kind of even shifted my mindset from the show can go on to the show must be planned responsibly and funded appropriately. So that's a very interesting statement for someone to make from a production background, and especially when speaking to the C-suite, the executive level individuals, of we can do all of these things with enough money and time. We can do anything. So how do we get that? And how do we take care of those individuals? People will work 80 hours a week. Why are we having people work 80 hours a week? Is it because we've planned poorly? And most of the time, the answer is, well, we didn't plan the best we could. We're running out of time. Why are we running out of time? So we focus on that opening date. And I would say if I had to, and also in one of my other hats as a theater consultant talking about sustainable operations, if I had to point to one opportunity that almost every organization has, it's a belief that the calendar must be put together in a certain way. And like many of our tightly held beliefs, is we've always done it this way. And I think if there's anything the last few years have taught us, is maybe there's a better way. Maybe there's a better way of doing things. People are speaking loudly now about what they are okay with and where their boundaries are. People are saying, I've learned to work remotely and I can do my job remotely. So for my mental health and for my wellness, doing this job remotely is what I need. So a lot of those things are really kind of taking hold. And I think that's a wonderful, wonderful outcome of a pandemic. And, all of the challenges we've been through, we're starting to see some very brave discussions happening in some places that I would have bet never would have had those conversations just a few years ago.
I think that's a really, really great point, is that we have a real culture, whether it's in entertainment at large or in theme parks in specific, of the cult of busyness, right? Of being the holding up as average, the overwork. One of the conversations I've been having in a lot of groups lately is that intergenerationally we have different understandings of what a day looks like and what it can be. And one of my favorite examples of this is the overwhelming motto that I don't think any of us who have been in this industry for more than 3 months have ever not used the phrase, we give 110%. So first off, technically, if I put on my engineering hat, that's impossible because 110% is past the breaking point and something has broken. But also fundamentally, that what is that 110% of? One of the most interesting things that I have the conversation of is I happen to generationally sit in an interesting place of I did not have this experience, but I can see it close enough to me that I thought it was going to be reality. That when my bosses say we're giving 110%, they're not saying of 24 hours. They're saying of 8 to 12 working hours. Mm-hmm. And what I find with my generation and most of the folks behind me is that when we think of 110%, we're thinking 110% of 24 hours. That all things are all and encompassed. And I find that we're watching kind of an endemic of overwork and burnout coming faster than we used to. Part of it is just we're now all available at all the time, and we haven't started to think about that. This year I've used the phrase, we're not working from home, we're sleeping at work so often, right? The amount of times that I've had the conversation with folks, it's very, very common in the early design phases that we work across a lunch and we just bring in salads, pizza, whatever, and keep going. And that, interestingly enough, it's working from home that has started to highlight that, because that's when we see like, oh, I can get up and go to the kitchen to make myself a sandwich anytime, but I can't keep having a business meeting that way in the same way that I eat across my lunch hour while also taking notes and working on something in the office. So I would love to talk a little bit more about the physical ramifications of overwork, right? So there's so much here that is mental health is also a physical health aspect, and physical health is a mental health aspect. Yep. That there are bigger, when we say it's very common now that people will put up the suicide prevention hotline, or even if the company offers a ComPsych or somebody else to talk to when you're having these real difficult acute times, right? Anytime we lose a coworker, we hear that reminder to make that appointment. But we don't hear, feel free to miss this meeting to make that appointment. And what does that create within us? Where do we go? How do we, like, what's a good tactic for working around that?
Well, and there's a lot to unpack there. There's a huge amount to unpack, and and so at so many different levels. And I think back to your original point of giving 110%. You're absolutely right. If we look at things and we think about our bodies and think about ourselves in the same way that we would a machine, we're not going to run a machine at 110%, because that just means we're going to break it faster. If we look at, show systems, and I look at different things on the deck, it has operational parameters, and it has those operational parameters for a reason. It has preventive maintenance schedules, and it has those preventive maintenance schedules for a reason. It has those checks. It has all of those balances that are built into the operating system. But do we build those same things into the operating system of our crew, the operating system of our culture? So I'm putting more effort, more maintenance time, and more thought into the inanimate object that I can replace, and not as much into the humans that I cannot replace in reality. I can replace in role, I can replace in title, but I cannot replace the human. So we really need to think about that from a different standpoint. And actually my doctoral research is exactly on those areas. And it really is in that area of the demands of our role and the resources we have to achieve that role. And how do we properly do those things? How do we create that balance? And as we think about that, and as we look at that, we have, when I started in the industry many, many years ago, I had a pager. Yes, I'm that old that I had a pager. But so yes, someone had access to me at all times, but that access to me depended upon, did I have the pager on my hip? Did I look at it at the right time? And did I make the decision to go to a phone to call them back to talk to about the situation? And yes, it was so long ago that I had to call them back. It wasn't a pager that they could put the message on.
And I'm going to jump in here too, because there's a piece there that I've found having conversations with other managers, with some of us who have kind of watched this arc, is that it also required the caller to hold still and stand at a phone until you got back to them. So it required them to cost time to it and think through whether this was this the best way, right? I can't tell you how many times now that somebody can text me from the toilet that I get the like, oh, hey, when was that thing? And it's like, per the 5 emails and the thing that we printed out and the schedule that we sent out, it's on your schedule. Look at it, Yep. And we all find kind ways to say that, and gently. But when I think about the amount of texts that get the equivalent of that, and I stop and I answer them, that I didn't used to get, because nobody was willing to give up an hour of their day to stand next to a landline to wait for me to call back after looking it up.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you were talking earlier about microaggressions, if we think about micro communication, is, we're getting that micro communication. So now, instead of sitting down and sending you the email with 5 bullet points of, hey, I need answers to these 5 questions, I'm sending you 5 separate texts, each of them probably not even a complete thought. And now I'm taking up a lot more time to get the message across. And, and technology is a wonderful thing. The ability to get in communication with somebody is a wonderful thing, but are we using it in the best way possible? If we look at teenagers, if we look at folks currently in school with social media, there's no time away. And we look at what that does to their mental space. And you mentioned the National Suicide Prevention Hotline, and I think that's such an important thing to call back to. When people are overwhelmed and people get into these spaces, and we hear the story, many large corporate employers, when this happens, they they will not tell the story. They will not share the story. They cannot share the story. So they then become, well, here's this app that you can use, or if you would like to talk to someone, here's the folks that we've identified that you talk to. Let's put the poster up. And so that actually, a situation similar to that, it was the inspiration to what became the task force that put together many of the tools that exist on the behind the scenes charity.org in their mental health and suicide prevention page. So we really talk about the warning signs and talk about, all of these things that, that are out there, knowing when someone is feeling this way, knowing when someone is having these feelings, and so many tools that exist in that space, and so many tools that exist from there, and really coming together and creating those tools. And some of the things that you'll see on the screen, were not only the National Suicide Prevention Hotline, but the bullying campaign. And so many people, when we did a huge survey of the industry to find out what the thoughts were in the industry, they told us they were exhausted. They told us they wanted suicide prevention resources. They told us that they were frustrated from being bullied in their workplace and seeing bullying in their workplace and not knowing what to do about it. So really putting together a group of experts, not just in the world of entertainment, not just in the theatrical world, but having folks that represent social work, that represent counseling, and that represent the mental health, the true mental health experts and the certified experts in the field, put together these tools. And when we launched the survey, we really launched it as let's find out what people want. We were hoping we would get 800 responses, would be great and huge for us. We had 3,000 before we brought the survey, into a close. And so really getting such huge response from the industry and getting that, what I personally believe is one of the largest data sets that exists in the industry, to show what people are feeling, what people are thinking, what people want, what they need, and what they're experiencing. Many verbatims were shared through this, and many stories were told through this, that people are having some terrible experiences and feeling as if they can't talk to anyone and feeling as if they have no outlet. And a chat app is great. One of the tools that is on the website is, a peer-to-peer chat app, but it's one of the tools. It's a therapist finder is also another tool. We really want to normalize that conversation and make it more common for someone to seek therapy and to seek someone to talk to. And not only seek someone to talk to, but seek someone who has an interest in our area, a knowledge of working with our individuals, an awareness of what that means, what our schedule means, what our timelines mean, what language we speak, and really just creating that network and creating an environment that makes it much, much more accessible for individuals within all of the industries that represent live entertainment to find those resources and find those outlets.
I think that, thank you for highlighting all of these, and I do encourage everybody to get, we've dropped the websites into, and specifically that Finder Tips page into the chat. I do have to go back and yes, clarify, thank you to the person who called this out in the chat, that a pager is a beeper. It was an item you wore that somebody called with a number to call back, and it beeped at you. Or then it vibrated, and then it could display a message eventually. That would tell you to call somebody back. And similarly, we have this conversation about the difference. When I started in entertainment, we were still using answering services for a lot of people. Not everybody even had voicemail. And that, again, every step towards immediacy is something that breaks down the time and allows us to work internationally with our teams even better. But it also eats into that time that we're used to having for ourselves. Many of you will notice that today I am sitting here knitting along with it. That's because sometimes as part of my access, I need, particularly when I have my neuro fidget days, my hands have to do something, or I'd be up out of this chair at least 3 times since Bryan was talking. This actually allows me to give attention to something, even though it looks like I'm not paying attention. one of the greatest phrases I was introduced to in the past year that it knocked me over because it was so obvious, is that we're all on a spectrum of access needs, but we're in a hierarchy of having those needs met. And there are some things that are really, really important about that. And again, I'm going to say it one more time. We're on a spectrum of having of our access needs. We all have access needs, right? But we're in a hierarchy of having those met. And I think we're in a really interesting time as we start heading back into offices, as we're starting to look at our sites coming back online. I'm finding that, unfortunately, we're not quite ready for what we're about to be asked for. When overwhelmingly, right, not everything is up and 100%. Our lives do not look exactly the way that they did a year and a half ago. And particularly in an international industry like ours, we started feeling pandemic effects in October of 2019. And many of our sites and companies, we've dealt with this before with SARS-2. We've dealt with this with MERS. This is bigger. But what we know from those instances is that these things don't go away, right? And as we're starting to approach long COVID, right, the physical needs of the last year, some of the mental needs that are going to happen. I think we have this, what I'm leading to is we have this tendency to tell ourselves that resilience equals endurance. And those are very, very different things. And what I see us not yet putting space to is we may finally be passing out of the endurance phase of I just have to stay alive through this, or I have to find the next job out of this. But this is where the healing and rest comes. And after that rest and integration is when we get to resilience. Bryan, I would love to talk with you about tools that we could deal with in that liminal space between we've survived, we're certainly not thriving yet, and we're not ready there. What are both the supports that we need, and what are things that we can give both ourselves and each other, right? We've got everything from active grief and active trauma of a pandemic, active reassessing and reawakening of trauma, and a whole lot of stumbling about how to deal with the lack of justice historically. Some folks are unpacking the colonialism and racism they've been raised with. Some are not yet there. That creates a whole lot of places for harm. And in amongst all of that is just the basic, we may have survivor's guilt. We may have, whether it's the grief of I've not worked in a year and I don't know how to not work, to I've been working, but I am not working at anything that's healthy, but I'm told I'm lucky for doing it. What are some of the things that we can do in a space that's not defined yet?
I think all very important points, and I think one of the most important things we can do is to understand that all of these things are a journey. We're understanding things a lot more. Nicola, you were talking about what our needs are from an accessibility standpoint. And in one of the chats that we have had in the past, when you were sharing the knitting, when you were sharing, fidgeting in meetings, I had the realization that for years I've been wearing bracelets and these things that I didn't realize that was a comfort thing for me. And so we're all on this journey, and giving ourselves grace to understand where we are on the journey, where other people are on that journey, and meeting each other where that person happens to be rather than where we think they should be or we want them to be. Many people went back to work and didn't feel that they could say they went back to work. I know many folks in the industry have been hiding that they're working, whether they are working back in the industry or whether they have taken work outside of the industry, because they feel if I show that I've taken work outside, then I'm not looked at as what my identity is in this world. And then the folks who have gone back to work, they're afraid to share, I'm happy to be back to work, but I know so many of my friends are not back to work. I know so many of them wish they were here. So I can't share my frustrations of feeling overworked, being overwhelmed, crushing expectations while being understaffed, because I should be grateful. And I believe you said earlier, they're being told they should be grateful in these spaces. So I think one of the most important things we can do in this is acknowledge where we are, acknowledge where we are on the journey, and then breathe, and then just breathe and recognize where we are. Silence is very difficult for people in meetings, in conversations. We think that if you're not saying something, then you're not participating, but it's okay. It's okay to have silence. And one of the things we talk about in the mental health first aid program is embracing the silence, and sometimes asking for the silence. And very often, when we're having conversations with another individual in a difficult conversation, I want to make sure that I'm listening to understand instead of listening to respond. And it may be important for me to just say, hey, before I respond to that, I need a minute to absorb, because I may need to absorb it at a different rate than what you're delivering. So let me just acknowledge, breathe, consider what you said, and process what you said before I talk about my response. And I think that that's one of the things that, the program does talk about. We talk a lot about self-care, and taking the time to understand what your needs are is such an important point, because for so long we've been looking at what is expected of us. Let's live up to what is expected of us. And let's not focus on what our needs are and how our needs fit into what is expected of us. So we're so afraid to say no, because somebody else might say yes, and so I'll get passed over. But how important is it to say, this is who I am, this is what I need, and if you cannot meet my needs, then this might not be the right place for me. And it's a difficult thing to say, and it's a scary thing to say. And how do we embrace that? And I don't have the answers. I won't even claim to have the answers. I think if there's anything that the years in the industry have taught me, is I know so much less than I thought I knew. And if I am the smartest person in the room, I am in the wrong room. If I am in a room of individuals that look and think like I do, I need to get the hell out of that room and bust open the door and get some other people into that room with me to change the thinking and change the thought process, and break down the systems. When we look at changing things, we so often look at the goal of the change, and we don't stop to look at the system of the change. I can't recall the book, but I read a book that was talking about changing systems and not focusing on goals. And not to use a sports analogy, but if we look at a football game, to get a first down, I have to move the ball 10 yards. I can either focus on, I need to move the ball 10 yards, or I can focus on, every time I touch the ball, I only need to take it 3 yards. That's all I need to do. So if I do that consistently, I don't need the 20-yard pass. I don't need the big play. I'm going to consistently get success, and I'm going to consistently reach my goal, but I'm focusing on 3 yards, not 100, just 3 yards. And so thinking about the system that leads to the success rather than the success sometimes, or rather than the goal, is really the important thing.
I would love to. Let's talk about some 3-yard goals. Right. Okay. So like one of my favorites that kind of came up as I heard you speaking is, we often forget, and I'm taking the position that most of us are still interviewing for work. Many of us have maintained our jobs, or we're stringing together things. But that means that we're more often in the case of interviewing or feeling out or having networking conversations about work foregoing from here. And one of the things I think we tend to forget in the getting of that Atomic Habits. Yes. Somebody identified that is, and it's a fantastic, it's talking about breaking down and picking it, like what's 5% I can do each day. right? Tiny, tiny bites of the elephant, not the whole elephant. One of my favorite that we can all do, right? It costs nobody anything, but it starts to make the point, is if every one of us asked every employer or client that we were about to start doing business with what they were doing to support their team through pandemic times, right? That tells you two things. One, what are you walking into and what are you expected to do as we ride out the coming years of change and structural change? If you're afraid of talking about the right now, we can go back to 2009. How did your company get through the economic shutdown that at that point decimated our industry, right? That's one that's not, we don't have to, if you're afraid of talking about the current trauma, we can talk about something we've weathered before. Or right now, when 90% of us are in this liminal space. What are some other things that are like that help raise the conversation, even if we don't have the big structural lever to pull of giving someone, let's say, a therapist?
Yeah, I think to your point, it all starts with conversations. It all starts with having those conversations and having the authentic conversations. I get so frustrated when I see posts from people that talk about leadership and do these things and be a good leader. And I just want to scream to the rooftops: be an authentic person first. If you are an authentic person and you have skills in leadership, you will be a good leader. But if you are trying to be a good leader because the principles say that a good leader does these things and you're acting the role of a good leader, then you're a great actor. You're not a great leader. So if you're an authentic person, you can be a great leader. You will make mistakes. You will say things wrong. You will unintentionally offend from time to time. But the important aspect is recognizing when you do those things and taking ownership when you do those things, and and thinking at all levels. I think the reason I bring up authenticity is I think we all need to begin from the authentic conversation. One of the examples that I often give is just think about where you go every day. Think about the number of conversations and interactions you have every day. And when you pass someone and they say, "Hello, how are you?" Our gut reaction often is, "I'm great, living the dream. Things are awesome." And things may not be awesome. You may not be living the dream. 99% of the time when I hear someone's living the dream, I know that they are not living the dream. They are getting by. And so when someone says to you, "Hello, how are you?" tomorrow, answer their question. Let them know. Stop for a moment and have a conversation with that person. They may have been throwing the thing at you to get a response because that's the polite thing to do. But you know what? The polite thing to do is wait for someone to answer the question that you asked them. And if we think about those conversations that we have with people that we don't really want to have, or that we're really not intending to have, or we're saying a thing because I'm supposed to say a thing, watch the looks on people's faces when they say, "How are you?" And you go, "You know what? I had a really rough morning this morning. Some things that were going on, my coffee overflowed. I forgot to put a filter. The counter was an absolute mess, and the traffic was terrible getting here. I stopped at 15 gas stations trying to get gas. People were putting it in paper bags, and so and just have a real, authentic conversation." And you may find yourself laughing and having a human connection with someone that you otherwise would have passed in the hall with just a "great." And if we approach everything from that standpoint of authenticity, it just opens the door of having more and more authentic conversations and breaking down so many of those barriers. If I can pass the vice president in the hallway and say, "Hello, how are you?" and have a conversation about their day, I'm much more likely to be able to have a conversation with that individual about business later, because we have a different connection and a different relationship that is not solely based on role expectations. So step by step, just from an authentic standpoint, just being who you are, and expressing who you are. And especially in our world now, being who you are and expressing your identity in the way that you feel your identity is such an important thing that if you can't do that, you can't be authentic in any other way. So, really creating that safe space, and those safe spaces are such an important thing when we're talking about mental health and wellness.
I'd love to keep going on that, right? So safe space is also what feeds into what we call psychological safety, which for all of my management process nerds out there, okay, maybe just me, Google did a whole study, right, called Project Aristotle, where it's part of their 80-20, where people can get a grant to study something, and then that might become a real project. So they actually had a project of people studying their projects to see what were the things that were most common to their most successful teams. And they came up with a list of about 5 points. I'm going to drop the website in here for it. And there's a couple of things that I think are really, really interesting about this whole study. Number one, the first thing of the 5 points, far and away and above of everything else, was this idea of psychological safety. And they break down on the Rework site what that means. And that very often that means having a wide spectrum of generational representation, of racial and cultural and global majority representation, that there is inclusion and equity, that there is safety in saying, I don't know, or being not the person who, in school we used to call them gunners, right? The first hand up, the heavy hitters, that it's actually important to not have a team full of gunners. And all of these things. What I find the most interesting as a practicing manager, right? Like I do a lot of consulting, but I don't just do consulting. I'm still an active project director and project manager. Is that fundamentally we read all of these things. We've all in this industry at this point read Simon Sinek's Start with the Why. We've read Creative Inc. We've written half of these books, if you're Bob Iger and half of our leaders, but we don't follow them. And that includes Google. So Google spent probably a couple million doing this, collecting data, figuring out what it was. And even they have yet to be able to convince their shareholders that it's okay to let go of the markers of busyness to do success and creative work. And I think what's so important for us to hear that and to have that conversation in our industry is that what we do is intellectually dangerous, right? It's dangerous to come up with what is the next greatest attraction, because very often that means breaking the rules of what we're going to do. It means breaking the rules and expectations of how we interact with each other. And we can only break the rules when we feel safe enough to say a wild and crazy idea. And we can only feel comfortable saying a wild and crazy idea when we also feel comfortable when Bryan asks me, how am I doing? And it's Tuesday morning and I can say, you know what? I'm having a real rough day because I miss my friend who passed away a year ago. And all I want to do is have a beer with him right now. What are some of the tactics that we can do to help create, right? And it goes back to that on this authenticity, right? It's not just, I need to have tactics to create the illusion of a safe space.
Yeah.
What is it to have a safe space?
I think one of the things, and if I look at the standpoint of leading a team and leading a project, one of the biggest mistakes that we make as team and project leaders is to let our opinions and thoughts be known too early. Because then we create an environment in which others want to agree, so that they can feel that if they are supporting the team, they are supporting the environment, they are supporting the vision. And so often that vision might be nearsighted. Unfortunately, in some of the spaces I used to work in the safety world, if we have someone who says, this is what I think we need to do in regards to the safety of this thing, I have now created an expectation, and I now have created a lane of thought that I have established, that this is the lane that I agree with. And so now I've put everyone in the room in a position that to bring up an idea counter to mine is to be counter to me, counter to your leadership, and counter to my expectations. Whereas if I sit and go, here's our challenge, and then sit back and shut up, because there's a reason that we have teams. And the reason we have teams is because everyone on that team brings a skill set that we do not have. And so we want to be smarter than we are individually. So as leaders and as individuals, when we see a problem and we define the problem, we can define the problem without presenting any solutions. And if we don't present any solutions, then we leave all solutions open. We leave all thinking open at that standpoint. And if someone starts to throw out an idea and I immediately say, you know what, that's really expensive, all ideas that would cause that kind of cost are now also off the table. So to quote Hamilton, don't let them know what you're against or what you're for, in these aspects and in these spaces, and let the thought process flow. Treat every problem as a creative solution. One of my favorite phrases when people would tell me that something was impossible is, I would ask, are you telling me that we are not creative enough to solve this issue? And instead of going, well, I don't agree with you, I was taking a creative person and I was challenging the thing that made up their identity, which was their creativity. And if you're telling me that we're not creative enough to solve the problem, and okay, well then we need other thought and other mind and other thinking in the room to solve this problem. But sometimes by asking, are we not creative enough to solve this? It's that, you know what, give me some time to think about it. Okay, great. Go think about it. And let's come back with some of these ideas. And I will tell you, many of the greatest ideas that I have seen work started in a room where 90% of the people in that room went, that'll never work. But one voice thought that it might. And what do you know, it did. We look at shows, and I think about, so many of the shows that I helped build and create, and look at, from a safety protocol standpoint, if I look at the sheer numbers, one of the safest shows I ever supported, they lit someone on fire multiple times a day. The number of injuries I had related to that specific stunt were significantly less than the number of injuries we had related to someone carrying a rope down the street wearing Capezio shoes. So T-strap shoes were more dangerous statistically than lighting someone on fire. So if you think about things in a different mindset and make all things possible, then we're not taking those things off the table. And I think the best thing a leader can do is not talk for a while and just let the process happen.
Awesome. I'd love to kind of spitball, and I'm going to kind of really encourage our folks who are watching to toss these into the comments and get in with us on here. I'd love to talk about, like, if we were to charette the things that we need and that support us, right? If nothing's a bad idea. And part of why I do this is because so often we find that these aren't things that haven't been done, and overwhelmingly the test scores show us that they're overwhelmingly positive. One of my favorite versions of this is well, it sure sounds ridiculous if you say, I want a 3-day weekend every week. However, we have multiple studies now that show that a 4-day work week is far more resourceful, efficient, and productive than the standard 5-day week. Mm-hmm. And I'd love to think about, like, what are some of those things, particularly now as we step into what's coming next, which is an industry that has spent the last 20 years working to make everybody a contractor and a project-based hire. In a world where we used to get all of those access needs met by long-term employment, right? What are those things, right? For me, one of those is flexibility of schedule, or being able to determine it, which it turns out, like, as difficult as being a contractor is, one of the fundamental definitions of whether somebody is a contractor or an employee is that they define their own schedule. What are some of the other things that we find help support people that we forget are there, right? It's not just the healthcare to meet the healthcare provider. It's the time to do so. What are some of those other things that help?
Well, and you said that bad ideas, and there's no such thing. Yeah, my belief is there's no such thing as a bad idea. There's just bad application of good ideas or bad timing of ideas. So everything's a good idea in the right mindset and in the right place. It just might not be the right one for now. And so much of what we see now, in so much of what we're seeing as the anxiety and the stress that individuals have, it's less about the role that they're in. It's about the hours, what they're missing. And when we think of, well, we want to give somebody the time so they can go home and sleep. They've been working for such long hours, they need to go home and sleep. And we forget that they might not be going home to sleep. They might need to go to their child's band concert, or they might need to check in on their mother who's in the assisted living facility, or they might need to do some of these other life things that we forget that people have. And so one of the things that's most important in this is understanding that every individual has different needs in timing, in recovery, in support. Healthcare, the support and the access to healthcare. If someone is fighting with different healthcare challenges and healthcare issues, those things are significantly more important than someone who does not have those challenges. So, that means different things to different people. And in so many places and so many organizations, we look at a one size fits all, or a here's 4 sizes, hope one of them fits you. And instead of looking at, what's that a la carte system based upon you and based upon where you are, that what do you need? The job sharing is another great thing. In several organizations I'm working with, they absolutely feel that they need someone on the ground in a space who can respond quickly. And then the questions become, it's like, you want that response because you feel you need it. But yet, if I look at the number of times you've asked this person to come to a venue, it's 5 in a year. So you're making a geographic decision on where someone must live to support this role based upon basically 30 or 40 hours over a collective year. So are we looking at that in the right way? And are we pushing out any other individual that's not willing to live in that location within 30, 40 minutes or an hour of the venue? We're pushing out the entire other population of individuals that may be well suited for that role. So I think I think step 1 is identifying our own needs, what we need. And step 2 for the employers and the organizations is starting to think about the models that we use, the staffing models that we use, the way we look at our human resources and how we apply those human resources in a new and exciting way. Let's face it, all of the models have been blown up. Everything has been exploded in the past couple of years, and we have an incredible opportunity to look at things differently, an incredible opportunity to break down many of those systems. And I'm very lucky to be part of several different organizations, between the Behind the Scenes Foundation, the United States Institute of Theater Technology, the No More 10 of 12s working group, which represents, looking at more humane working hours based upon a concept from the Actors Equity contracts, and really looking at how do we build schedules in our industry? Must we build schedules in this way? Must we think of the work week in the way that we have before? Must we look at overtime the way we look at? Is overtime necessary for someone to survive? And why have we created a situation where it is necessary to survive? And why are we working in a system where I tell you that you have this time to do your job, but if you do it outside of that time, I'm going to pay you extra. Why don't I just give you the time that you need and pay you appropriately to do it at such a time where you can get the appropriate amount of sleep?
That's a great, we've got a question in the comments that tags right into this, so I want to jump on it. As a newcomer in the themed entertainment industry, what are thoughts for asserting for mental health needs? And what are better strategies for being taken seriously when we push back on allowing time for that work, preventing the overworking, avoiding to be taken advantage of? What are things that you've seen gain traction? Because I think that's the hardest, right? Is the cudgel that is used overwhelmingly is, well, we've always done it this way, so you should be able to do that in 5 days, or whatever version of that is, right? Yep. There's no more dangerous answer than we've always done it this way, but boy, do we rely on it.
Yeah, Nicola, and I want to give credit where it's due. One of the statements that I've heard you say many times is all of our operating procedures and all of our guidelines assume that we've had appropriate sleep. So, if the standard operating procedure is this is what we do in this period of time, whether it be an 8-hour time frame, it makes the assumption that we have shown up well rested in the mental capacity to handle what we have going on. And so I think, and to look at Anna's question and to think about that appropriately, the first part of that is understanding what part of the industry you're sitting in. What is the role that you're doing? Because it's going to look different in every one of those roles. Understanding, are you working under a collective bargaining agreement? Are you working under specific contracts? What are the guidelines within that contract? And how are they being applied? How are they being used appropriately? If you are a freelance person, what agreements did you make in that? I have a habit in many of the contracts that I do from a freelance perspective is, I have a day rate, but my day rate assumes a specific window of time is a day. If someone wants to reach out to me outside of that day, then that's a different rate. And so I put some of those things in, and I'm lucky enough to be in a place where I can put some of those protections in for myself, to hold both myself and my clients accountable to that. But to your point, I'm in charge of my schedule. So those are the luxuries that I understand that I have. And those are privileges that I understand that I have that don't exist for everyone. So really looking at, what are those agreements? What are those assumptions that an individual is working under? And do they understand what your entire schedule looks like? One of the things, and speaking from a performer standpoint and looking at some of the roles that I've done in the past, is being lucky enough to have the skills to have multiple roles in multiple locations. I may be doing one thing in the morning and then having a break and then doing another thing in the evening. But neither of those two locations really know that I'm doing that over there and then coming over here and do this. Am I having those conversations? Do they understand that my performance might be suffering in the evening role because of what I did this morning? Or do they understand in the morning role because of how late I was there in the evening doing this and being in rehearsal and all of that, and the lack of sleep I've gotten before that, how that's affecting my performance in the morning? So being honest with what those things are, being honest with what the needs are, and taking that time. I've watched way too many people in the past in performing roles, in technical roles, that will use the system that is in place to go out on a medical leave or become injured, because if I'm injured, then I can't do this job, and the only way that I could get some rest is to have an injury. And so we've done many of those things to ourselves in these places by not listening to what the problems are, not listening what the staffing issues are, and looking at overtime as a Band-Aid. And, I'm sorry to go back to that overtime thing. But that's one of the things that we want to think about. And, I just saw this coming up in the chat as well. Disclosing conditions for the fear of stigma. it is difficult sometimes to disclose a specific condition, but also think about some of the work restrictions and some of the rules that we all work under. If you are on medication or you have a condition and you need accommodations, there are legal protections for most of those scenarios. And asking for those accommodations are absolutely reasonable. And, and I would say to, specifically from a stigma standpoint, if an individual is going to hold it against you that you need those accommodations and you are looking for a way that you can continue to do the work and continue to do your role and perform at your role at the level of expectation, then you're doing the right thing rather than continuing to do the role, knowing that you may be unsuccessful without those accommodations. And I think that's one of those that we need to break that stigma and begin to have the honest conversations that accessibility and accommodation is an expectation, not a nice to have. You were selected for the role, or you identified for a role, whatever that role may be, because of a specific skill set that you bring. And if you need accommodations of some type to continue to perform, then that is absolutely a reasonable request. And it should be taken seriously.
So I'm going to jump in on some super active tactics here. Things that I didn't know were strange in themed entertainment because I came in from tours. I came in from a whole lot of other active places. So here's something. Starting in 1947, thanks to the Taft-Hartley Act, you do not have to be a member of a union to be covered under the collective bargaining agreement of that union. Why do I bring this up? This means you can go get your hands on the collective bargaining agreements of any set of work that might be relatable or equivalent to what you are doing now. And I specifically want to bring this to the ways that Anna and Emily brought these questions, right? What is a way of dealing with not being taken advantage of? One of the biggest is to know your worth. And like, I'm not kidding. When I do interviews, I have a spreadsheet that I put behind the face of the person I'm interviewing on my little Zoom or WebEx or however we're doing it, or I make myself look at it, right? I know what those numbers go to and what they pay for. A reason that I know what that baseline is because I was a member of collective bargaining units in my earlier careers. But I know I can look that up. So if you're a writer, the Writers Guild of America contract sheets for a TV writer is not wildly different than the amount of work that we are asking you to do as a show writer for an attraction. That can give you a baseline. It might not be exact, like you're not going to walk that in and show the table to the hiring person, but that tells you a number that other people with your equivalent experience are using. The same thing with the art directors and show set designers unions out of Hollywood and film, right? You may not be covered under that agreement, but you can go pull a table that tells you what those rates are. Every production designer for TV is relatively similar to our production designer roles for an attraction. That gives you a baseline. When we talk about wanting to be allies and advocates for each other, the biggest thing any one of us can ever do, truly, is making sure that everybody who is working within our zone knows what we are billing. If we're contract workers, like what is your day rate? What are you offering for that? And the only people who benefit from us not talking about that are the employers. And yes, with everything I'm about to go in on, I just heard about 20 sphincters pucker around the world, and that's okay. Because none of these things are hidden. You just haven't had somebody hand them to you yet. Learning the words, and this goes really heavily into accommodation and stigma. Learning the words that trigger action in corporate America are very useful for how we make our requests. So to Bryan's comment on, I very commonly point out every safety procedure we've ever written for anything, right? Whether it's a construction site or the office we're in, the presumption, we don't write out the assumption, but the baseline presumption is that everybody entering into that safety agreement has had 8 hours of sleep, is properly and nutritively fed for that body, and has appropriate rest and restroom access and time. I need to sometimes point out, right, that, compliance to our basic occupational safety standards expects that we've all gotten 8 hours of sleep. When was the last time any of us could say for the meeting room that we were in that everybody in that room, whether physically or virtually, actually got 8 hours of sleep? The word you're looking for there is compliance. We are out of compliance from our basic occupational safety needs. And that's where accommodation conversations come in. I strongly recommend that any job you ever take, you print out the job description you got during interviewing, you make sure you have a copy of it that cannot be adjusted, and you get one on your starting date. Because that's where certain things like expectations of hours, expectations of physical capacity, and even emotional capacity either should be listed, or if they're not, cannot be expected, right? We are, whether we like it or not, contract workers. Even in our longer term roles, at this point, we're all contract workers. What does your contract say when you sign it? Because if it doesn't, they cannot also require you to do that. That makes it a point at which you can negotiate a different rate or adjustment. In one of the chats, somebody just pointed the other duties as assigned clause, right? You have within your power, when you see a job description that says other duties as assigned, to ask what historically that has included. Now, I say this as a woman who once strapped a drum to her head and rode a bicycle in a parade as part of a site supervisor position, because that's what it asked for, and it was something I could do. It may or may not be, that's not going to be within everybody's purview, capacity, or capability. And it doesn't have to be, right? Because at no point did they say could handle the wind drag of a drum strapped to your head. It is wholly reasonable for you to represent something as a barrier to success, right? That's another great phrase to bring up, barrier to success. And I want to point back to something that you said, that being a newcomer makes you a particular target for low-level contract work. Yes, it does. It also means that you have every right and remainder, and depending on what state you're in, the rules are different, to remind them that you are a contract worker, not an employee. There are different structures and requirements and expectations of your availability to a role as a contract worker. And one of the biggest in the States that defines you as a contract worker is that you define your schedule. They can define when something is due, so you may not always be able to push for the amount of time additional to something. But what you can push back on is what else you have to do in the delivery of that. A really great example of that for thought work is when somebody says, whether it's a piece of art or a script, or a review of something, a safety standards matrix, whatever it is that is your deliverable item. If the only way you can deliver that, let's say they want it in 3 days and they're not going to budge, and you say, I think I might need more, and then you're like, great. Then the contracted amount that you are willing to do for 3 days for that dollar amount contains only that deliverable. And you are not available for any further meetings or input from them from the commencement of that work until the deliverable, without further discussion of time and compensation, right? What you're doing is defining expectations and parameters down further and further and further. And it's exhausting and it's difficult. But this is where we do have our power. This is where we can stand in things and say, like, hey, great. Then that means you can always question and redefine something back. So I've kind of jumped around, and I'm going to finish out on a couple of other tactics around accommodation and disclosure of difficulty, right? So we are never required to disclose our any of our health or mental access needs. And all access needs are at some level a health access, because if you don't get it and you're overstressing yourself, the body just dumps cortisol into your system. And that's why we have an overwhelming level of gallstones, kidney stones, and other what we call physical weathering health issues in this industry, right? It's because we keep treating ourselves like we can run on fight or flight for decades at a time. So one of the things that I want to put back in here is some of our folks who are entering the workforce now came through with a system of what was called IEP, which was an educational plan or protocol that you used to make with the educational work that you're in. There is no system for an IEP within either contractual or employment work in the US. However, there is that contracting and employment discussion about what will be provided, right? That's a conversation that we should always be happening when we start a job. What is going to be provided to me in terms of workstation, in terms of furniture, in terms of parking space, any of those things, right? That's a real conversation. When we're contracting, we can just start from the position of, to be successful, I require these things. You don't always have to list it as an accommodation. You don't have to, you are under zero reason to tell someone why you need something. However, if what we want to trigger is the many laws and protections on accessibility, then how you want to open that conversation is from what is available to what you need. This is where it does come into, like, think about writing the operations guide for you, right? Back to what Bryan said, which is something that I often, right? We don't turn on a lathe in a fabrication shop and just run it full bore for years on end. It has a maintenance schedule. It has times at which it has to be pulled apart and re-oiled, right? Like, that's a basic checkup and physical. It has care procedures. It has dust collection, and dust collection is a great analogy for mental health needs, right? It seems like nothing, but if it gunks up, you're in real trouble. You don't have to ever tell somebody why, but if you can articulate what those things are that you need, I need every Thursday evening off because that's when I go line dancing. And line dancing is how I have a communal touch base of anything as a human. You don't have to tell them why. You just have to tell them when you're not available. And if there's a reason that they cannot meet that accommodation, you need to set up what it is that's going to happen. A great example of this is very often when I see somebody specify that they need a standing desk, and then somebody from facilities just delivers them a standing desk, but they didn't have the conversation of what equipment was really needed. And many standing desks are physically actuated and require you to be able to apply 25 pounds or more of force to lift them and the weight of the equipment you've put on them. Well, does your job description require you to be able to lift 25 pounds? I mean, some of us have that job description. So if so, or if not, then you have the discussion to say, I need, and this is where your reference comes in, right? Be your own reference librarian. Have found the equipment needs for what works for you. This is also really key when we start looking at working spaces as we're coming back into them. Most of us have discovered that we don't work super well in open pits, right? So it's okay to state, I do my best work I do my best work with giant headphones like this on. That does not really welcome large amounts of conversation. That focuses me. But similarly, the amount of times that we have worked in zones where, because of glare on monitors, we dim out the lights above us or create overhead hangings with either fabric or foam core so that our drafters can work, right? That's a glare issue. That can be the same thing just because you can't take extra inputs. You don't have to state why for that accommodation to be considered. But what I find makes those things most successful is when we are very specifically clear about the outcome of not doing it and what the thing is that we need and how. We're trying to give people pathways to succeed. And when you frame it that way, like what overwhelms the system is when you come in and say, it's too loud in the open zone. When we put the onus on the company to solve the issue, they don't know what is actually needed for our success, right? That's different from saying, I need a workspace that is isolated so that I can do my best work and focus. And when I don't have that, it takes me 3 times as long.
Yeah, I think with all of those things, I mean, there's so much of what we need, and it all kind of comes back to what we need to feel ourselves, and what we need to feel protected and cared for in our spaces, and that, you know, that kind of is what the mental health first aid program is all about, and the work that Behind the Scenes Foundation is doing is all about, is giving us the tools to take care of ourselves and to take care of others. If we think about the analogy of, you know, of the burning building, if I'm on fire, I can't lead anyone out of the burning building. So step one is I have to take care of myself. If I take care of myself, I'm more suited to take care of others. And then it's about having those tools, which is why that toolbox is so important. And putting together the toolbox is so very important, because so many times we're asking the question of, how do I take these steps? How do I use this language? What is the language? And some of the resources that you will find on that Behind the Scenes resources page, you know, it's the toolbox talks. It's the conversations of, how do I talk about mental health and mental wellness in my space? How do I talk about suicide prevention in my space? How do I talk about bullying? How do I talk about some of these things? How do I recognize some things that I should be concerned about, and knowing those warning signs and understanding that. And when we talk about operating procedures and operating parameters, if you think about an individual, we all have our own operating parameters. My floor of sad is in a pretty consistent place. This is where I go to when I'm sad. My ceiling of happy is in a pretty consistent space. If I'm operating on the other side of either one of those lines, then for the individuals who know me, that's a flag. That gives them, you know, some concern to go, hey, you know, Bryan's he seems really, really sad today. I think I'm going to reach out and say, hey, you know, how you doing? How are things going? And the door to open and the door to talk about that. You know, one of the things that we see in the mental health space, and especially when we're talking about suicide prevention, is it only takes one voice. It only takes one person. And one of the campaigns that you will also see in those resources is be the one to. Be the one to speak up. Be the one to reach out. Be the one to make the connection. Because you never know how you asking, how are you doing today? And then somebody's being able to tell you, and somebody be able to share. And just the response of, you know what? You're not alone in that. I hear what you're saying. Your feelings are valid. Your thoughts are valid. Being able to say those things and be comfortable to say those things and open that door can literally save a life. And you may never know. And sharing that knowledge. And so I would like to invite anyone to, you know, whoever has questions of those, you know, to reach out, and we will be posting more available dates. If you do go on the site and look at the available dates of training, we should be dropping the next few months of training here shortly. So if you don't see availability right now, please check back in a few days, or check back within a week, and we should start seeing some more of those available dates.
Awesome. Yeah, I think one of the things that I want to call out that Bryan pointed there and just really elevate it is, truly great leadership is leadership that listens, is certain and authentic in its own needs, and does not assign those needs to everyone who it is working with, whether it is above or below. And I think that overwhelmingly, that's where we're starting to see the shifts, right? When somebody can say, I don't know that need, but if I can listen and recognize it and say, that makes perfect sense, of course. How do we find a step towards that? That's good leadership. The most destructive, and I hesitate to call it leadership, it's management. The most destructive management out there is, well, yeah, you say that, but I don't think it's really important because we've not done that. That is the single one thing I will ask anybody to never say, is like dismissing anybody's concern dismisses their experience. And the more that, and you can always ask, can you tell me more about that? Can you help me understand, right? It's okay if you don't understand it, but you need to work to understand it. And that's what I really want to highlight behind the scenes for, is it's giving us those tools to do that and to continue having these conversations. Here at TETV, we're going to have a lot more programming as we go forward, talking about different groups, different styles of interaction with this industry we're all working in, and what it takes to get there. I will highly invite anybody today. This was a fantastic conversation. I want to thank you all for joining. I want to thank you all for taking the vulnerability to jump in with us. And as somebody who is routinely producing content for this channel, if you want to continue this topic and you have somewhere you want to get into, come chat with me on HBD about that. We will happily put together, if we want to just do another 5 easy things you can do, and we'll do 5 easy things as an employee, 5 easy things as a contract, 5 easy things as a manager that you can take, right? I can always find you 5 steps that cost nothing to take towards this for yourself and your coworkers. But the one challenge I will leave everybody, no matter your power or privilege level on this call, would be to sit down and really think, make the operational guide for your best body and mental health. Start acknowledging what you need, because when we turn away from our own needs, that's what makes it easy to turn away the needs of everyone else around us. And it might be as simple as, I need fruit roll-ups on Thursdays. Like, truly, if that works, do it. Or if there's a reason that doesn't work for you, ask why. The more that we each do this work for ourselves, the more we are able to hold still when somebody says something that is uncomfortable for us, and to allow us to support the work of others. And I think that's really where I want to, as we're kind of wrapping down here, that's what I want to leave this, is walking away with, what can we do to build our capacity for ourselves and others? And part of it is recognizing our baseline. And part of it is building our capacity to sit even when something's uncomfortable, and say, oh, I see what you need. And I see how that can be better for all of us. I also want to thank again Kelsey Connolly, our producer, and Reagan Willman, our shadow, and everybody who joined in, even reminding me to articulate what a pager is. It's like, we have all of we're sitting at a really interesting time where we all have to remember that nothing is an equivalent lived experience. And I think that's such a beautiful reminder for those of us who are creating experiences and immersion, is that we are actually all coming to things with a different lens, and we can really build in this space by caring for ourselves and others. Brian, what's the best way for people to get a hold of you going forward?
The best way for folks to get a hold of me is, for the mental health information, is to go through the behind the scenes charity site. There is a contact on there. So if you're looking for mental health first aid, if you're looking for information at that program, reach out to behind the scenes charity. If you would like to reach out to me, you can find me at Bryan, Bryan, at honeybadgerentertainment.com, and that's HUNEY BADGER. So you can reach out to me in any of those ways. And I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to amplify the work that's going on. It's such important work, and it's work for all of us. And the more individuals we can have in the community that have this language, that have these tools, the more effective we can all be, and the better that we can lift each other up.
Yep. Well, thank you all. I look forward to further conversations as the specials and the standard rolls on. And I really do. I invite you, if you're a manager, if you're a leader, if you are a facilitator who's going, gosh, I'd love to offer mental health with Bryan, but start writing down your butts and let's talk about it. I'll be the butt girl. Come talk to me. We're going to sort that out, because it might just be we need to coordinate 3 offices who are going to take this training together to make it worth it. We need to talk about where are our boundaries and barriers within the industry of breaking it through. And part of that means not making it look effortless and talking about where the challenges are. So let's keep moving. Let's take one good step tomorrow. Think about one good step will be for you and those around you. And with that, have a wonderful Thursday evening. And if you're watching at any other time, have a wonderful ongoing day. Thank you all so much for this opportunity and for joining us.